Subscribe to Storylab for more stories. Now let's begin this one. Chapter 1. The Perfect Life. Martin Terrell stood in the doorway of his suburban home, watching his wife Tricia arrange flowers in an expensive crystal vase. To any observer, they were the picture of success. A beautiful house in Maple Heights, 2 luxury cars in the driveway, and all the trappings of the American dream. But Martin's trained eyes noticed things others missed. The way Tricia's phone was always face down, her sudden interest in evening book clubs, and the expensive lingerie hidden beneath her everyday clothes. For 8 years, Martin had played the role of the devoted husband and successful security consultant. What Tricia didn't know was that his consulting was a carefully constructed cover for a much darker past. Before meeting her, Martin Terrell had been known by a different name in circles where men killed for country and coin. He'd been one of the best, a ghost who could slip in and out of situations that would destroy lesser men. "You're home early," Tricia said without looking up, her voice carrying that distant tone he'd grown accustomed to. "Wrapped up the Morrison contract ahead of schedule," Martin replied, studying his wife's reflection in the hallway mirror. She was still beautiful at 32, with auburn hair and the kind of figure that turned heads. But beauty, he'd learned long ago, could be the most dangerous weapon of all. Their marriage had been good once. Martin had genuinely loved her, had believed he could leave his past behind and build something real. He'd met Tricia at a charity gala, where she worked as an event coordinator. She'd been charmed by his quiet confidence and mysterious air, never pressing him about his work or the scars that occasionally showed when he thought she wasn't looking. But people change. Or perhaps, Martin reflected, they simply reveal who they've always been. "I'll be out tonight," Tricia announced, finally turning toward him. "Sarah's book club. We're discussing that new thriller everyone's talking about." Martin nodded, knowing full well that Sarah Morrison, wife of his former client, was currently in Europe with her husband. He'd been watching, listening, gathering intelligence the way he'd been trained. The signs were all there, had been for months. Phone calls that ended abruptly when he entered the room. Unexplained charges on credit card statements. The subtle shift in their intimate life. "Enjoy yourself," he said simply. As Tricia gathered her purse and keys, Martin caught a glimpse of a text message notification on her phone. "Can't wait to see you tonight. Gorgeous. D. Martin had already identified him. Dominic Vaughn, attorney at Wheeler, Vaughn and Associates. 41 years old, recently divorced, with a reputation for aggressive tactics both in and out of the courtroom. The kind of man who saw what he wanted and took it, regardless of who got hurt in the process. After Tricia left, Martin descended to his basement office. To anyone who might stumble upon it, the room looked like a standard home office with a few security system monitors. But behind a false wall lay the tools of his former trade. Equipment that officially didn't exist, contacts that operated in the shadows, and resources that could make problems disappear permanently. He activated his secure computer and began pulling files on Dominic Vaughn. The man had built his career on ruthlessness and connections, particularly his relationship with Judge Melvin Ross, whom he'd known since law school. Together, they created a network that bent the rules in favor of those who could pay the price. Martin's phone buzzed with a message from an old contact, package delivered as requested. Target acquired. The pieces were falling into place. Martin had spent 3 months preparing for this moment, knowing it would come. He'd hoped he was wrong about Tricia, had wanted to believe in the life they'd built together. But betrayal, he'd learned, was like cancer. It had to be cut out completely, no matter how much it hurt. As he reviewed the surveillance photos of his wife and her lover entering the downtown hotel, Martin felt the familiar coldness settling over him. The man who tried to live a normal life was gone. In his place stood someone far more dangerous, someone who understood that mercy was a luxury he could no longer afford. Chapter 2. The Truth Unfolds. The surveillance footage was damning and detailed. Martin sat in his office at 2 a.m., methodically reviewing 3 months of documentation. Tricia and Dominic Vaughn had been meeting twice a week, their affair growing bolder with each encounter. What made it worse was listening to the audio recordings, conversations where they mocked him, calling him the boring security guard, and laughing about how easy it was to deceive someone so trusting and simple. Martin's jaw tightened as he heard Dominic's voice through his earpiece. He has no idea what's coming. When you file for divorce, Ross will make sure you get everything. The house, the assets, even his precious little business. Guy's been living in a fantasy if he thinks he can keep any of it. Trisha's laughter was like ice in his veins. I almost feel sorry for him. He thinks we're this perfect couple. Martin's so predictable. Comes home, watches his security monitors, reads his military history books. He has no idea I've been copying his files for months. Martin paused the recording. She'd been in his office, going through his files. The basement door had security measures that should have kept anyone out, but Trisha had always been resourceful. He pulled up his system logs and found the intrusions, times when she'd accessed his space while he was away on business. She'd been careful, but not careful enough for someone with his training. The next recording was even more revealing. Dominic's voice carried a cruel satisfaction. Your husband's little security company is about to have some serious problems. I've got connections with the state licensing board. A few well-placed complaints about improper procedures. Maybe some questions about his background that he can't answer. The man will be finished in this business. Martin turned off the audio and leaned back in his chair. They weren't just planning to leave him. They were planning to destroy him. In their arrogance, they saw him as nothing more than an obstacle to be removed. They had no idea they were declaring war on someone who'd spent 15 years learning how to win battles they couldn't even imagine. His phone rang, breaking the silence. The caller ID showed private number, but Martin recognized the encrypted tone that meant secure communication. Peril, status report, came the gravelly voice of Robert Hatch, his former handler. Martin had reached out to him 2 weeks ago, reactivating channels that had been dormant for nearly a decade. Targets identified and confirmed. They're moving faster than anticipated. Divorce papers will likely be filed within the week. You sure about this path? Once we start, there's no going back to your suburban life. Martin looked around his basement office, at the wedding photo on his desk that now seemed like a relic from someone else's life. That life ended the moment they decided to betray me. I need full package support, documents, resources, and cleanup crew on standby. Understood. Package will be delivered tomorrow. And Martin? Good to have you back in the game. The line went dead. Martin spent the next hour making additional calls, reaching out to contacts across the country. Jake Prince, a former teammate who now ran specialized security operations in Chicago. Al Roberts, who managed discreet financial services for people who needed to move money without questions. Christian Montoya, whose tech skills could make digital evidence appear or disappear at will. By dawn, Martin had assembled a team of professionals who understood the kind of work that required absolute discretion. Each had their own reasons for staying in the shadows, their own skills that the legitimate world couldn't fully utilize. As the sun rose over Maple Heights, Martin prepared for his final day as the man his wife thought she knew. He showered, dressed in his usual conservative business attire, and prepared breakfast with the same routine he'd maintained for years. When Trisha came downstairs, hair tousled from what she claimed was a late night at Sarah's book club, he kissed her cheek and asked about her evening. It was wonderful, she lied smoothly. We had such a deep discussion about betrayal in relationships. Fascinating how people can live with such deception. Martin smiled, pouring her coffee. Indeed, I've always believed that betrayal reveals true character, both in those who commit it and those who respond to it. Trisha's eyes flicked to his face, searching for hidden meaning, but Martin's expression remained perfectly neutral. She had no idea that her husband was already thinking 10 moves ahead, planning a response that would be swift, decisive, and absolutely devastating. Chapter 3. The Courtroom Trap. The papers were served on a Tuesday morning while Martin was reviewing security footage for a client. The process server, a nervous young man named Cameron Brock, apologized profusely as he handed over the divorce documents. Martin accepted them calmly, even tipping the kid $20 for his trouble. The petition was exactly what he'd expected based on the recordings. Trisha was claiming irreconcilable differences and demanding 50% of all assets, including his business. Dominic Vaughn's signature was on every page as her legal counsel, and the case had been assigned to Judge Melvin Ross. No coincidence there. The court date was set for the following Monday, giving Martin less than a week to prepare. In the legitimate world, that would be impossible. But Martin wasn't operating in the legitimate world anymore. His team had assembled by Wednesday. Jake Prince arrived first, a compact man with graying temples whose unassuming appearance masked decades of tactical expertise. Al Roberts followed, bringing with him financial documents that would have impressed the IRS with their creativity. Christian Montoya came in through the basement, having bypassed every security system in the neighborhood without triggering a single alarm. Status report. Martin said, activating the secure conference system. Jake spoke first. Dominic Vaughn thinks he's untouchable because of his connection to Judge Ross. What he doesn't know is that Ross has some interesting gambling debts in Atlantic City. Debts that are about to become very problematic for him. Al opened his briefcase, revealing stacks of documents. I've traced the financial connections between Vaughn and several questionable real estate deals. Nothing illegal per se, but the kind of thing that would raise uncomfortable questions if it came to light during a high-profile divorce case. Christian's laptop showed surveillance footage from multiple angles. Your wife and her boyfriend have been very indiscreet. I've got recordings of conversations that would make even their mothers blush. More importantly, I've identified their next move. They're planning to have you declared mentally unstable. Vaughn's lined up a psychologist who will testify that your obsession with security indicates paranoid delusions. Martin processed the information with a cold efficiency that had once made him legendary in his former profession. Countermeasures? Already in place, Jake replied. The psychologist, Dr. Wallace Bright, has some very interesting research funding sources that don't quite add up. He'll be too busy dealing with his own problems to testify against anyone. Monday morning arrived with the crisp clarity of a perfect autumn day. Martin dressed carefully in his best suit, navy blue, conservative, the kind of outfit that suggested a man who played by the rules. He arrived at the courthouse an hour early, taking time to study the building's layout and security measures. Old habits died hard. Tricia and Dominic arrived together, making no effort to hide their relationship. Dominic wore an expensive gray suit that probably cost more than most people made in a month. He carried himself with the swagger of a man who'd never lost a case in his friend's courtroom. Tricia had chosen a black dress that managed to be both elegant and subtly seductive, exactly the kind of outfit designed to make a judge sympathetic to a wronged woman's plight. The courtroom was smaller than Martin had expected, with worn wooden benches and fluorescent lighting that made everyone look slightly sick. Judge Melvin Ross presided from his bench with the authority of someone accustomed to having his word be final. He was a heavy-set man in his late 50s, with the kind of face that suggested he enjoyed the finer things in life, good food, expensive wine, and the power to control other people's destinies. Good morning, Judge Ross said as the proceedings began. This is a preliminary hearing in the matter of Terrell versus Terrell. Mr. Vaughn, I understand you're representing the petitioner. Dominic rose with practiced confidence. Yes, Your Honor. My client is seeking dissolution of marriage based on irreconcilable differences, along with an equitable distribution of marital assets. Martin sat quietly at the defendant's table, having declined legal representation. This had clearly surprised everyone involved, but he'd insisted on handling his own defense. To their eyes, he probably looked like an amateur facing a professional, exactly the impression he wanted to create. Mr. Terrell, Judge Ross said, his tone carrying a slight edge of condescension. I strongly advise you to retain counsel. Divorce proceedings can be quite complex, and Mr. Vaughn here is one of our most experienced family law attorneys. I appreciate the advice, Your Honor, Martin replied evenly, but I believe I can adequately represent my interests. Dominic smirked, exchanging a glance with Tricia. They thought they were watching a lamb walk into slaughter. The preliminary arguments proceeded exactly as Martin had expected. Vaughn painted Tricia as a long-suffering wife married to an emotionally distant man obsessed with his work. He presented evidence of Martin's excessive security measures and suggested that such behavior indicated deeper psychological issues. Then came the moment Martin had been waiting for. Dominic slid a settlement agreement across the table, his voice dripping with false sympathy and barely concealed triumph. In court, my wife's boyfriend, a lawyer, laughed. "The judge is my friend. You're leaving this room with nothing, soldier." My wife smirked. "He's too scared to even speak. Look at him." He slid a paper in front of me. "Sign it." Now, he had no idea who I really was. Martin looked down at the paper, then slowly raised his eyes to meet Dominic's gaze. For just a moment, he let his mask slip, let Dominic see the cold calculation of a predator sizing up its prey. "I think," Martin said quietly, "there's been a misunderstanding about who exactly you're dealing with." Chapter 4. The Hunter Revealed. The change in Martin's demeanor was subtle but unmistakable. The mild-mannered security consultant vanished, replaced by someone whose very presence seemed to alter the temperature of the room. Judge Ross noticed it first, his confident smile faltering as he met Martin's steady gaze. "Perhaps," Martin continued, rising slowly from his chair, "we should postpone these proceedings until everyone has a complete understanding of what's at stake here." Dominic's laugh carried a note of uncertainty now. "Your Honor, I think we're seeing exactly the kind of delusional behavior my client has been dealing with for years." "Delusional?" Martin reached into his jacket pocket and withdrew a slim folder. "Judge Ross, I believe you might find this interesting reading. It's a comprehensive report on your gambling activities in Atlantic City over the past 6 months. Particular attention should be paid to page 12, which details your debt to Vincent, the Shark, Morrison, a gentleman who, I'm told, has very creative collection methods." The color drained from Judge Ross's face. "Mr. Terrell, I don't know what you think you're—" "Oh, but I do know," Martin interrupted smoothly. "You see, Vincent Morrison happens to be an old acquaintance of mine. We served together in some very unpleasant places during my previous career. When I mentioned that you'd be presiding over my divorce, he was quite interested to learn about your mutual financial arrangement." Dominic shot to his feet. "Your Honor, this is clearly intimidation and should not be." Martin's attention shifted to the lawyer with laser focus. "Mr. Vaughn, I have similar documentation regarding your recent real estate investments, particularly the property on Elmwood Drive that you purchased for considerably below market value from Mrs. Flora Dorsey, an elderly widow who wasn't fully informed about the development plans that would triple the land's worth within 6 months." "That's completely legal," Dominic blustered, but his confident facade was cracking. "Legal, yes. Ethical, debatable. But I'm more interested in how you learned about those development plans 3 weeks before they were announced publicly. Mrs. Dorsey's grandson, Nathan Howell, works for the city planning department. I believe he's been quite cooperative with federal investigators looking into municipal corruption." Tricia finally found her voice. "Martin, what are you doing? This isn't like you." Martin turned to his wife with the cold smile of a shark scenting blood. "Isn't it, Tricia? You've been in my office, copying my files. Did you really think I wouldn't notice? Did you believe that a man who spent 15 years in military intelligence wouldn't detect amateur surveillance in his own home?" The courtroom fell silent except for the hum of fluorescent lights. Martin continued, his voice never rising above conversational level, but carrying the weight of absolute authority. "You see, all of you made a fundamental error in judgment. You assumed I was exactly what I appeared to be, a simple security consultant trying to live a quiet suburban life. What you fail to understand is that some people choose quiet lives precisely because their previous lives were so very loud." He walked to the center of the courtroom, commanding attention like a general addressing his troops. "My name is Martin Terrell, but that's not the name I was born with. For 15 years, I operated under various identities in places where the American government needed problems solved quietly and efficiently. I've eliminated terrorists, extracted assets from hostile nations, and made entire criminal organizations disappear without a trace." Judge Ross's hands were visibly shaking now. "Mr. Terrell, these proceedings are becoming highly irregular." "Oh, we're just getting started, Melvin." Martin's use of the judge's first name was deliberate, stripping away another layer of official protection. "You want to know what's irregular? It's irregular for a sitting judge to take bribes from lawyers in exchange for favorable rulings. It's irregular for an officer of the court to manipulate the legal system for personal gain. It's irregular for a married woman to conspire with her lover to destroy her husband's life and livelihood. Dominic was frantically whispering to Tricia, but Martin's enhanced hearing caught every word. The lawyer was telling her to deny everything, to claim that Martin was having a breakdown. But Martin had planned for that too. "Christian," Martin said, speaking to what appeared to be empty air. A voice responded from hidden speakers throughout the courtroom. "Yes, sir." Broadcasting now. The room's monitors flickered to life, displaying high-definition footage of Tricia and Dominic in various compromising situations. But more damaging than the physical evidence were the audio recordings. Conversations where they mocked Martin, planned his destruction, and laughed about how easy it would be to manipulate the legal system in their favor. "Gentlemen, meet Christian Montoya," Martin announced as a lean figure stepped out from behind the court reporter's station. Former NSA cyber warfare specialist, now a freelance digital artist. He's been documenting your activities for the past 3 months. The footage continued, showing Dominic meeting with known criminals, Judge Ross accepting cash payments, and Tricia systematically photographing documents in Martin's office. Each revelation hit like a hammer blow, destroying the carefully constructed lies they'd built their plan upon. "So here's what's going to happen," Martin said, his voice cutting through the chaos. "Judge Ross, you're going to recuse yourself from this case due to conflict of interest. Dominic, you're going to withdraw as counsel and recommend that Tricia seek independent representation. And Tricia," he turned to face his wife, who was now staring at him as if seeing a stranger. "You're going to discover that divorcing a ghost is considerably more complicated than you imagined." Chapter 5, The Web Titans. The courthouse emptied quickly after Martin's revelations, leaving behind only the echoes of shattered plans and destroyed reputations. Judge Ross had fled to his chambers. Dominic was frantically making phone calls to damage control specialists, and Tricia sat alone on a bench outside the building, staring at her phone as if it held the answers to questions she was only beginning to understand. Martin found her there an hour later. She looked up as his shadow fell across her, and for a moment he saw a glimpse of the woman he'd once loved, vulnerable, frightened, and completely out of her depth. "Who are you?" she whispered. "I'm a man you married," Martin replied, sitting beside her on the bench. "I'm also the man you betrayed. Both things are true. I don't understand any of this. The things you said in there, the people you claim to know, it's impossible. You're a security consultant from Denver. I've seen your background, your references. You've seen what I wanted you to see," Martin interrupted gently. "A carefully constructed identity designed to let me live a normal life with the woman I loved. Did you really think someone could run a successful security company without understanding how to create and maintain false identities?" Tricia's hands were shaking as she processed the implications. "The business trips you took, you said they were client meetings. Some were. Others involved tying up loose ends from my previous life. There are people in this world who don't simply retire from the kind of work I used to do. They have to be very careful about how they disappear." A black sedan pulled up to the curb, and 2 men in expensive suits got out. Martin recognized them immediately, Vincent Morrison's associates, here to discuss Judge Ross's gambling problem. As they walked past, one of them nodded respectfully to Martin. "Jesus Christ," Tricia breathed. "You really do know these people." "I know all kinds of people, Tricia. The question now is what you plan to do with that knowledge." She turned to face him fully, and he could see her mind working, trying to find an angle, a way to salvage something from the wreckage of her plan. "What do you want from me?" "Nothing," Martin said simply. "I want nothing from you, nothing with you, and nothing to do with you. You made your choice when you decided to betray me. Now you get to live with the consequences. But the house, the assets, gone." Martin's voice carried the finality of a closing vault. "Did you really think I'd let you profit from destroying me? Every account you thought you'd identified, every asset you believe you could claim, it's all vanished into financial instruments you can't touch and jurisdictions you can't reach." Tricia's face went white. "You can't do that. There are laws. Laws apply to people who exist in the legitimate world." Martin Terrell, security consultant, was a creation designed to give you the life you said you wanted. Now that creation is being dismantled piece by piece. A second vehicle arrived, this one a police cruiser. Detective Katie Rutherford got out and walked toward them with the measured pace of someone who'd seen enough of life's ugliness to remain unimpressed by most revelations. Mr. Terrell, I'm going to need you to come with me. We have some questions about the documentation you provided this morning. Martin stood, straightening his tie. Of course, Detective. I assume this is about Judge Ross's situation. Among other things, the federal prosecutors are very interested in your insights regarding municipal corruption. As they walked toward the police car, Tricia called after him. Martin, wait. We can work this out. We can fix this. He paused and looked back at her one final time. No, Tricia, we can't. You see, I learned a long time ago that some betrayals can never be forgiven. Some bridges can never be rebuilt. When you decided to destroy me, you should have made sure you could finish the job. The police car pulled away, leaving Tricia alone on the courthouse steps. She had no way of knowing that Detective Rutherford was actually one of Martin's contacts, or that the interrogation would consist of him providing testimony that would bring down a corruption network that had been operating for years. She couldn't comprehend that her husband, former husband, she corrected herself, was already 10 moves ahead of anything she might attempt. Back at the house that night, Tricia found herself locked out of every account, every credit card canceled, every access point to their former life severed with surgical precision. The house itself remained legally hers, but without income or credit, keeping it would be impossible. She called Dominic, desperate for answers, but his phone went straight to voicemail. When she drove to his office, she found federal agents carrying out boxes of files while Dominic stood in handcuffs, shouting about his rights and demanding his phone call. That evening, she sat in the empty house, surrounded by the life she'd thrown away for passion and greed. The irony wasn't lost on her. She'd plotted to destroy Martin and leave him with nothing, only to discover that she'd been living in a carefully constructed illusion all along. Her phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. You wanted to see who Martin really was. Now you know. Some ghosts are better left undisturbed. A friend. Outside, a figure watched from the shadows as lights went out in the house that had once been a home. Martin Terrell, the security consultant, was gone forever. What remained was something far more dangerous, a man with nothing left to lose and all the skills necessary to ensure that justice, however harsh, was finally served. Chapter 6. Dominic's Fall. The federal courthouse was a very different environment from Judge Ross's corrupt domain. Here, amid marble columns and the weight of legitimate justice, Dominic Vaughn found himself facing charges that could end both his career and his freedom. The arrogance that had served him so well in manipulated proceedings crumbled under the scrutiny of federal prosecutors who couldn't be bought, intimidated, or charmed. Martin sat in the gallery, watching as his wife's lover was systematically destroyed by the evidence Christian Montoya had gathered. The recordings were devastating. Not just the conversations about Martin, but discussions of bribes, case fixing, and a pattern of corruption that stretched back years. Assistant U.S. Attorney Emma Lucas presented the case with clinical precision. A woman in her 40s with sharp features and sharper instincts. She'd built her reputation on bringing down corrupt officials who thought themselves above the law. Mr. Vaughn, she addressed the defendant. These recordings indicate that you've been operating a conspiracy to manipulate the judicial system for personal gain. Can you explain to the court your relationship with Judge Melvin Ross? Dominic's attorney, Brett Allison, a public defender who looked overwhelmed by the complexity of the case, objected weakly. Your Honor, my client's relationship with Judge Ross is purely professional. Professional? Lucas smiled coldly. Let's listen to Exhibit 47. The courtroom speakers crackled to life with Dominic's voice. Ross will do whatever I tell him to do. The man owes me more than money. I've been covering for his gambling addiction for 3 years. Without me, his wife finds out about Atlantic City, and his career is finished. The federal judge, Arthur Austin, was a stern man in his 60s who'd seen enough corruption to be genuinely offended by it. Mr. Vaughn, the court is prepared to offer you a plea agreement in exchange for your full cooperation in the prosecution of Judge Ross and other members of this conspiracy. Dominic whispered frantically with his attorney, sweat beading on his forehead despite the cool courtroom air. The confident lawyer who'd mocked Martin just days before was gone, replaced by a desperate man watching his world collapse in real time. What kind of cooperation? Brett Allison asked. Complete disclosure of all illegal activities, surrender of all ill-gotten assets, and testimony against co-conspirators. In exchange, the government would recommend a sentence of 5 to 7 years instead of the 25 to life your client is currently facing. Martin watched Dominic's face cycle through anger, denial, and finally, desperate calculation. The man who'd built his life on manipulation was now completely outmaneuvered, trapped by his own recorded words and the inexorable machinery of federal justice. During a recess, Martin stepped outside for air and found Detective Rutherford waiting for him by the courthouse steps. "Your intelligence was accurate," she said without preamble. "We've arrested 12 people in the past 48 hours, including 3 judges, 5 attorneys, and 4 city officials. The corruption network was larger than we initially thought." "I suspected as much," Martin replied. "Men like Vaughn don't operate in isolation. They build systems that protect and enable their behavior." Speaking of systems, there's something you should know. Your wife has been asking questions, trying to find out where you are, what's happening to you. She's hired a private investigator. Martin's expression didn't change, but Detective Rutherford had enough experience reading people to catch the subtle shift in his posture. "What kind of questions?" "The kind that suggest she doesn't understand how completely her situation has changed. She seems to think this is all some elaborate negotiation tactic, that eventually you'll come back to the bargaining table." "I see." The private investigator she hired is Wallace Bright, former police detective, now working private security. He's good at his job, but he's not operating in your league. Should we be concerned about him? Martin considered this. Wallace Bright was competent enough to be dangerous to civilians, but woefully unprepared for the kind of opposition Martin could provide if necessary. Monitor his activities. If he becomes a problem, we'll address it appropriately. Back in the courtroom, the proceedings continued with methodical efficiency. Emma Lucas presented bank records showing how Dominic had funneled money through shell companies, property transfers that benefited his network of corrupt contacts, and a pattern of case manipulation that had affected dozens of innocent people over the years. The most damaging evidence came from Dominic's own files, which Christian had accessed during his digital infiltration. Every bribe, every threat, every manipulation had been carefully documented by a man who'd never imagined that his private records could be turned against him. The defendant operated under the assumption that his connections made him untouchable, Lucas told the jury during closing arguments. He used his position as an officer of the court to corrupt the very system he was sworn to uphold. He destroyed lives, perverted justice, and enriched himself at the expense of everything our legal system represents. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours. When they returned, their verdict was unanimous on all counts: guilty of conspiracy, bribery, racketeering, and abuse of process. Judge Austin's sentencing was swift and merciless. "Mr. Vaughn, you have corrupted one of the fundamental institutions of our democracy. You've used your legal training not to seek justice, but to pervert it for personal gain. This court sentences you to 18 years in federal prison, with no possibility of parole for the first 10 years. As Dominic was led away in shackles, his eyes found Martin in the gallery. For a moment, the two men stared at each other across the courtroom. Dominic's expression carried a mixture of hatred and fear, the look of a man who'd finally understood exactly what kind of enemy he'd made. Martin remained perfectly still, offering no gesture of triumph or satisfaction. Justice had been served, but this was only the beginning. Dominic Vaughn had been a symptom, not the disease itself. The real problem, the betrayal that had started this entire cascade of consequences, still required resolution. As the courtroom emptied, Martin's phone buzzed with a message from an encrypted number. Phase 1 complete. Phase 2 authorized. Command. Martin deleted the message and walked into the afternoon sunlight, where another chapter of his carefully orchestrated revenge was about to begin. Chapter 7. The Private Investigator. Wallace Bright had been a good detective during his 20-year career with the Denver Police Department. He understood how to follow leads, read people, and uncover secrets that others wanted to keep buried. What he didn't understand was that some secrets were buried for very good reasons, and some people were far more dangerous than they appeared. Trisha had hired him 3 days after Dominic's arrest, desperate to understand what had happened to her carefully planned life. She'd offered him $10,000 to find out everything he could about her husband's mysterious past and current whereabouts. "I need to know who he really is," she'd told Bright during their first meeting. "Everything he told me was a lie. The business, his background, even his name might be fake. I need leverage." Bright had taken the case because he needed the money and because he'd grown bored with insurance fraud investigations and missing person cases. A mystery involving government conspiracies and hidden identities sounded like exactly the kind of challenge that would reinvigorate his investigative instincts. He started with the basics: property records, business licenses, tax filings. Martin Terrell's paper trail was impressive in its completeness and boring in its banality. Security consultation company registered 8 years ago, modest but steady income, all permits and licenses properly maintained. If it was a cover identity, it was professionally constructed. The breakthrough came when Bright started checking military records. Martin Terrell had supposedly served in the Army for 6 years, achieving the rank of sergeant before receiving an honorable discharge. But when Bright dug deeper, he found inconsistencies, gaps in the timeline, decorations that didn't match the service record, and references to units that seemed to exist only on paper. "Either this guy is a fraud," Bright muttered to himself, "or he's someone whose real service record is classified so far above my clearance level that I shouldn't be looking for it." He was photographing documents in the basement office of the house. Trisha had given him a key when he heard the front door open. Footsteps moved through the house with the measured pace of someone conducting a thorough search. Bright drew his licensed firearm and crept toward the stairs. "Mr. Bright," a calm voice called from the living room. "I'm unarmed and would like to speak with you." Bright recognized the voice from the recordings Trisha had played for him. Martin Terrell himself. "Stay where you are," Bright called back. "I'm armed. I'm aware of that. I'm also aware that you're investigating me on behalf of my estranged wife. I'd like to offer you some information that might change your perspective on this case." Against his better judgment, Bright climbed the stairs and found Martin sitting calmly in the living room, hands visible, posture relaxed. He didn't look like someone who'd just caught an intruder in his home. "You have 30 seconds, Bright said, keeping his weapon drawn but not directly aimed. "Your service record shows tours in Iraq and Afghanistan. Good soldier, clean record, commendations for bravery under fire. You understand the concept of operational security and the need for classified information to remain classified. What's your point?" Martin reached slowly into his jacket and withdrew a folder. "My point is that some information is dangerous to possess. The kind of dangerous that can get good people killed for asking the wrong questions to the wrong people." Bright kept his distance, but glanced at the documents Martin placed on the coffee table. What he saw made his blood run cold. Official letterhead from agencies he wasn't supposed to know existed. Authorization codes that suggested levels of classification beyond anything he'd encountered in the military. "These could be fakes," Bright said, but his voice lacked conviction. They could be genuine warnings that you're walking into a situation that's far above your clearance level. "Tell me, Mr. Bright, when you were in Kandahar, did you ever wonder about the operations that happened in the deep desert? The missions that didn't appear in any official reports?" Bright had wondered. Every soldier in theater had heard whispers about ghost units, operations that officially never happened, men who appeared and disappeared without explanation. "Yeah, I wondered. I was one of those ghosts. For 15 years, I did things that allowed men like you to serve with honor in official capacities. When I retired, I tried to build a normal life with a woman I loved. That woman decided to betray me, and in doing so, she awakened something that should have stayed buried." The weight of the implications settled over Bright like a cold fog. "You're telling me to walk away from this case. I'm telling you that your client doesn't understand what she's dealing with. Neither, apparently, do you. But you're a veteran, and you understand operational reality. Some battles can't be won, and some enemies shouldn't be provoked." Martin stood and walked toward the door, pausing only to add, "Your client owes you $10,000. I suggest you collect it quickly and find another case." This one ends badly for everyone who isn't already dead. After Martin left, Bright sat alone in the house, staring at the documents on the coffee table. His investigative instincts told him to dig deeper, to uncover the truth behind the carefully constructed mysteries. But his survival instincts, honed by 2 tours in combat zones, told him something very different. He thought about Dominic Vaughn, facing 18 years in federal prison. He thought about Judge Ross, whose gambling debts had apparently made him a target for very dangerous people. He thought about the systematic way Martin's enemies were being destroyed, piece by piece, with the precision of a military operation. When Tricia called that evening, asking for an update, Bright made a decision that probably saved his life. "Mrs. Terrell, I'm returning your retainer and closing this case. I'd advise you to accept whatever settlement your husband offers and disappear as quietly as possible." "What? You can't just quit. I need that information." "No, ma'am. What you need is to understand that some doors shouldn't be opened. Your husband isn't the man you thought you married, but he's also not someone you want as an active enemy." He hung up and spent the next hour destroying every note, photograph, and piece of evidence he'd gathered. Some mysteries he'd learned were better left unsolved. Chapter 8: The Final Gambit. 2 weeks after Wallace Bright walked away from her case, Tricia Terrell was a woman without options. The house was in foreclosure, her credit card were maxed out, and every legal avenue had been systematically closed off by forces she couldn't understand or counter. Desperation had replaced arrogance, fear had replaced confidence, and she was finally beginning to comprehend the magnitude of her miscalculation. She found Martin at the downtown diner where they'd had their first date 8 years ago. It was a small place with cracked vinyl booze and coffee that tasted like it had been brewing since the Clinton administration, but it had once held happy memories for both of them. Martin was sitting in their old booth, reading a newspaper and drinking coffee, as if he had all the time in the world. He looked up when she approached, his expression neutral but not hostile. "Tricia, I wondered when you'd find me here. You've destroyed everything," she said, sliding into the booth across from him. "The house, the accounts, Dominic's career, even that judge, you've ruined all of it." "I've exposed it," Martin corrected. "There's a difference between destruction and revelation. Dominic chose to be corrupt. Judge Ross chose to take bribes. You chose to commit adultery and conspiracy. I simply ensured that choices have consequences." She studied his face, searching for some trace of the man she'd married. "What happened to you, Martin? This isn't who you were when we met, isn't it?" Martin folded his newspaper with precise movements. "Or is this exactly who I've always been, and you simply chose not to see it? Did you think a man could run successful security operations without understanding how to neutralize threats? Did you believe I could command the respect of dangerous clients by being weak? I thought you were just a consultant. You thought I was convenient. A stable provider who could give you the lifestyle you wanted while being boring enough not to interfere with your other interests. You never asked about the scars, the nightmares, or why I sometimes disappeared for days at a time. You didn't want to know who I really was." Tricia's hand shook as she reached for his coffee cup, needing something to steady herself. "What do you want from me? I told you before. Nothing. This conversation is a courtesy, not a negotiation. But there has to be something. Some way to fix this." Martin was quiet for a long moment, considering her words. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of absolute finality. "Tricia, there are 3 kinds of people in this world. There are those who build things, those who maintain things, and those who destroy things. For 15 years, I was paid to destroy things, terrorists, criminal organizations, threats to national security. I was very good at it." He leaned forward slightly, and she saw something in his eyes that made her understand why dangerous men had once feared his name. "When I married you, I thought I could become someone who builds things instead. I tried to build a life, a marriage, a future worth having. But you decided to be someone who destroys things. So now you get to learn what it's like when someone who's very good at destruction decides to target you personally." "Martin, please." "There is no please anymore. There is no negotiation, no compromise, no path back to what we had. You made your choice when you decided to betray me. I'm simply ensuring that you live with the full consequences of that choice." He stood and placed money on the table for his coffee. In approximately 1 hour, you're going to receive a phone call. The caller will offer you a way out of this situation, a chance to start over somewhere far from here. I suggest you take it. What kind of offer? The kind that comes with strict conditions and no room for negotiation. But it's the only offer you're going to get. As Martin walked toward the door, Tricia called after him one last time. What if I refuse? What if I fight this? He paused without turning around. Then you'll discover exactly how creative I can be when someone continues to threaten my peace. And Tricia? I've had 8 years to plan for every possible contingency. There is no scenario where you win this fight. An hour later, Tricia's phone rang. The voice on the other end was female, professional, and utterly without warmth. Mrs. Terrell? My name is Gwen Arias. I represent certain parties who have an interest in resolving your current situation. We're prepared to offer you a relocation package that includes housing, employment, and a modest living stipend. Where? A small town in Montana. Population approximately 3,000. You would work as a clerk in a general store. The position pays minimum wage, and you would live in a studio apartment above the store. That's insane. I can't live like that. Mrs. Terrell, the alternative is to remain in your current situation with no assets, no income, and no prospects. Additionally, we've received intelligence suggesting that some of Mr. Vaughn's former associates blame you for his downfall. These are not people known for their forgiving nature. The threat was subtle but unmistakable. Tricia was trapped between her husband's systematic revenge and the violent anger of criminals who held her responsible for their own exposure. If I agree to this, what are the conditions? No contact with your former life. No attempts to return to Colorado. No social media presence. You would essentially cease to exist as Tricia Terrell and become someone else entirely. And if I refuse, then this offer expires, and you'll face whatever consequences emerge naturally from your current circumstances. Tricia sat in the empty house that night, surrounded by the remnants of a life she'd thrown away for passion and greed. Outside, Denver continued its bustling existence, indifferent to her personal catastrophe. She thought about Dominic, beginning his first year in federal prison. She thought about Judge Ross, whose gambling debts had apparently made him disappear entirely. She thought about her husband, who'd proven to be something far more dangerous than she'd ever imagined. At midnight, she called the number Gwen Arias had given her. "I'll take the offer," she said. "Very wise. A car will pick you up at 6 a.m. Bring only what fits in one suitcase." The line went dead, and Tricia spent her last night in Denver packing the fragments of a life that had once seemed so perfect and secure. Chapter 9. The Reckoning. 6 months later, Martin Terrell sat in a different diner in a different city, reading about the trial of the century. Judge Melvin Ross had been found dead in his Atlantic City hotel room, an apparent suicide brought on by his exposure as the center of a massive corruption network. Dominic Vaughn was serving his federal sentence in a medium-security prison, where his legal skills were about as useful as his expensive suits. The corruption investigation had expanded far beyond Denver, uncovering similar networks in 3 other states. Emma Lucas had been promoted to lead the federal task force dedicated to cleaning up judicial corruption nationwide. Detective Katie Rutherford had received a commendation for her role in breaking the case, though the full extent of her cooperation with Martin remained classified. Christian Montoya had disappeared back into the digital shadows, his work complete and his identity once again buried beneath layers of encryption and misdirection. Jake Prince was running a legitimate security consulting business in Chicago, though his client list included several individuals whose legitimate activities were questionable. Al Roberts had retired to a beach house in Costa Rica, his financial expertise having proven valuable to certain parties who prefer to keep their monetary affairs private. Martin's own situation had stabilized into something resembling normalcy. Martin Terrell, security consultant, had been quietly dissolved, his clients transferred to associates who could handle their legitimate security needs. The man who had once been known by that name now operated under a different identity in a different city, doing different work for people who understood the value of discretion. His phone buzzed with an encrypted message, "New assignment available. Target is a trafficking network operating out of Miami." Interested, Martin deleted the message without responding. He'd returned to his old life, but on his own terms now. Some missions he accepted, others he declined. He took cases that appealed to his sense of justice and turned down those that were purely mercenary. It wasn't the quiet suburban life he'd once dreamed of, but it was honest in a way that his marriage never had been. A young woman approached his table, Veronica Bowers, a federal prosecutor who'd been briefed on his background and given authority to liaise with him on certain sensitive matters. "Status report?" she asked, sliding into the booth across from him. Tricia Terrell has successfully integrated into her new life. She works at Morrison's General Store in Havre, Montana, and lives alone in a studio apartment. No contact with her former associates, no attempts to return to Colorado, no violations of the agreement. And you? Any regrets about how this played out? Martin considered the question seriously. Regrets imply that I would choose differently given the same circumstances. I wouldn't. Betrayal requires consequences, or it becomes an acceptable strategy. That's a cold way to look at marriage. Marriage requires trust. When that trust is broken deliberately and maliciously, the marriage ends. Everything that follows is simply the resolution of outstanding debts. Veronica opened a folder and placed several photographs on the table. These are recent surveillance photos from Miami, the trafficking network I mentioned earlier. They're moving children through a network of corrupt officials and compromised businesses. Local law enforcement can't touch them, and federal prosecutors need evidence that would stand up in court. Martin studied the photos with professional interest. The faces were those of men who'd grown comfortable with their power, confident that their connections and resources made them untouchable. It was an arrogance he recognized, having seen it destroyed so thoroughly in his own case. Time frame: 6 months to build the case, another 6 to prosecute. But these people have money, lawyers, and political connections. It won't be easy. Martin smiled, not the warm expression of a suburban husband, but the cold calculation of a predator identifying its prey. "Ms. Bowers, I spent 15 years making impossible things possible. 6 months is plenty of time to show these people what happens when their victims find a champion." As Veronica left with his acceptance of the assignment, Martin reflected on the strange, circular nature of his life. He tried to leave his violent past behind, only to discover that some skills were too valuable to abandon entirely. The difference now was that he chose his targets, selected his missions, and answered to his own moral code rather than the expedient needs of government bureaucrats. His phone rang, not the encrypted line used for business, but a regular number he maintained for legitimate contacts. The caller ID showed unknown number, but the area code was from Montana. "Hello, Martin." The voice was hesitant, frightened, but unmistakably familiar. "Hello, Tricia. I know I'm not supposed to call. I know this violates the agreement. But I had to tell you something." Martin waited silently, letting her gather the courage to continue. "I'm sorry. Not for getting caught, not for losing everything, but for betraying you in the first place. You deserve better than what I gave you. I know saying it doesn't change anything, but I needed you to know that I understand what I threw away. I appreciate you telling me that," Martin said after a long pause. "But you're right, it doesn't change anything. You made your choice, and now you're living with the consequences. That's how justice works. I know. I wanted you to know that I think about what we had before everything went wrong. Sometimes I wonder if there was ever a chance for us to work things out." "No," Martin said without hesitation. "There wasn't. Some betrayals can't be forgiven, Tricia. Some bridges can't be rebuilt. You crossed a line that ended our marriage the moment you decided to cross it. I understand. I won't call again. See that you don't. The agreement you signed is the only thing standing between you and some very unpleasant alternatives. Honor it." After she hung up, Martin sat quietly in the diner, processing the unexpected contact. Part of him, a very small part, felt something that might have been pity for the woman who'd once shared his life. But pity was a luxury he couldn't afford, and mercy was a gift she hadn't earned. He paid his check and walked into the afternoon sunlight, where a new mission waited and fresh enemies would soon learn the same lesson that Tricia, Dominic, and Judge Ross had learned too late. Martin Terrell was not a man who forgave betrayal, and he never forgot the debts that justice demanded be paid in full. The ghost had returned to his work, and somewhere in Miami, powerful men were about to discover exactly what it meant to attract the attention of someone who'd spent 15 years perfecting the art of making problems disappear permanently. Justice, Martin had learned, was not about forgiveness or redemption. It was about ensuring that actions had consequences, that betrayal carried a price, and that some debts could only be paid in full measure. As he walked toward his next assignment, Martin carried with him the cold satisfaction of a man who'd settled his accounts completely and was ready to help others do the same. The reckoning was complete, but the work of justice never ended.
This is where our story comes to an end. Share your thoughts in the comments section. Thanks for your precious time. If you enjoyed this story, then please make sure you subscribe to this channel. That would help me a lot. Click on the video you see on the screen, and I will see you there.